23rd March, 1994. Over the Black Mountains of southern Siberia. In the left seat of Aeroflot Flight 593, the captain is proud. His children are in the cockpit of a brand new Airbus A310. 16 minutes later, every voice on that flight will be silent.
The night over Siberia. The cabin lights were dimmed to a warm amber, casting a soft glow over rows of dozing passengers as Aeroflot Flight 593 pressed eastward through the freezing darkness. Outside, the world was an empty, moonless void, just a few distant stars, and the faint suggestion of clouds sliding past 33,000 feet below the A310's swept wings. At 0039 local time, somewhere high above the rugged Kuznetsk-Alatau mountain range of southern Siberia, the aircraft was a small, bright island of civilization, suspended over a black, uninhabited wilderness. From the cockpit forward, a gentle murmur of Russian speech mixed with the soft hiss of conditioned air and the periodic chime of cockpit alerts acknowledging routine changes from air traffic control. Aeroflot Flight 593, operating from Moscow Sheremetyevo to Hong Kong, was not a special flight on paper. The manifest showed 63 passengers and 12 crew members, a modest load for the A310, and the route was a now familiar corridor for the newly emerging Russian commercial presence in global air travel. But the night was special for one man on the flight deck. In the left seat sat Captain Andrei Viktorovich Dutov, a 40-year-old veteran of Soviet and now Russian aviation, and in the cabin behind him sat his children, for whom this journey was supposed to be a quiet marvel, a chance to see what their father actually did when he went to work and flew airplanes. The Airbus A310 itself was a relatively new arrival in Aeroflot's fleet. Built in Western Europe and equipped with advanced flight computers, it represented a visible break from the rugged, analog-heavy Soviet airliners that had dominated Russian skies for decades. Inside the cockpit, this difference was obvious. Instead of a busy forest of dials and gauges on every surface, the crew worked with digital displays, Electronic Flight Instrument System (EFIS) screens, showing attitude, navigation, and engine parameters in crisp, glowing symbology. On this leg, the three-person flight crew reflected that blend of old and new. Captain Dutov and First Officer Yegor Voronin had spent much of their careers on traditional Soviet aircraft, then retrained on the Airbus, learning a philosophy of managed flight, in which computers filtered and moderated pilot inputs. Behind them sat relief pilot Captain Igor Piskarev, who would share duties on the long overnight route to Hong Kong. The mood on the flight deck was professional but relaxed. Cruise altitude had been reached. The engines were steady, and the long trans-Siberian portion of the journey had settled into its usual rhythm. Few passengers in the cabin knew much about the machine carrying them. Some might have recognized the Airbus logo on the safety card, or noticed that the cabin seemed quieter and more spacious than older Soviet types. But to most, it was just another airplane. For the children on board, particularly the captain's daughter and son, the experience was something closer to a secret privilege. They had been allowed to visit their father's domain, the cockpit, that mysterious, button-covered room at the very front of the aircraft where adults spoke quietly into microphones, and the view went on forever. In the early 1990s, cockpit visits, especially on Russian and many international airlines, were still a common, almost charming part of air travel. The locked, reinforced doors of the post-2001 world were still years away. Back then, it was not unusual for pilots to invite family members or even select passengers up front, especially in cruise, to see the instruments and the view. By the time Flight 593 was cruising at altitude, the cockpit door was no longer just a boundary between passengers and crew. It had become a revolving point between the professional world of the flight deck and the informal human world of a father showing off his workplace. What no one realized was how thin, in this particular cockpit, the boundary had also become between harmless curiosity and the delicate envelope of an automated airliner's flight control laws. For now, though, nothing seemed out of place. The Airbus tracked steadily along its assigned route, autopilot engaged, following a programmed path toward Hong Kong, while the crew monitored systems and chatted in low, unhurried tones. Outside, the landscape below was as unforgiving as it was invisible. Steep, forested mountains, sparsely populated valleys, and long stretches where, in the event of an emergency, there would be no easy place to land. Yet from the cockpit windows, there was no sense of menace, just the standard, almost boring smoothness of modern high-altitude cruise, that strangely peaceful phase of flight when danger feels most remote. Every so often, the captain glanced back toward the cockpit door, aware that just a few meters away, his children were experiencing the flight in a way most people never would. The pride of a father and the habits of a professional aviator coexisted easily in his mind. After all, he had flown for years through the rigid hierarchies of Soviet airlines and the chaotic transition of the early 1990s, and nothing serious had ever happened on his watch. On the instrument panel, the primary flight display showed a stable horizon line, the aircraft symbol centered, altitude and speed markers well within safe margins. The autopilot, via the Airbus's fly-by-wire style control systems and flight management computers, held heading and altitude with imperceptible precision. In principle, the Airbus A310's philosophy was straightforward. The pilots told the airplane what they wanted: an altitude, a speed, a route, and the automation figured out the best way to get there. The autopilot could be engaged or disengaged with a simple control input. Subtle pilot movements on the control column, if sustained, could prompt the system to quietly transfer more of the flying back to human hands. The human eye and inner ear are poorly adapted to perceiving gradual changes at high altitude, especially in the absence of visual references. A slight drift in bank angle, just a degree or two, can be functionally invisible if the motion is slow enough and there is no horizon to compare against. In the kind of night that surrounded Flight 593, the instruments were the only reliable truth. Comfort, familiarity, and the absence of any immediate alarms made it easy to trust that nothing unexpected was happening as the hours ticked by. This comfortable routine, this easy coexistence of automation and human presence, was what made modern jet flight so safe, and, under the wrong circumstances, so dangerously deceptive. On Flight 593, the stage was being quietly set for a chain of small, individually understandable actions to intersect with a complex automation logic in a way that almost no one had anticipated. Within minutes, that calm, uneventful cruise would be replaced by something no one on board had ever trained for. An Airbus in a steep, uncommanded bank and descent, with pilots trying to regain control of a machine that was no longer behaving as they believed it should. But in this first, deceptively ordinary stretch of the flight, there was no hint of the violence to come. Only the soft hum of engines, the faint clink of glasses in the galley, and a father's quiet satisfaction at sharing his world with his children. The visit to the cockpit. By the time the aircraft reached its long, steady cruise segment over southern Siberia, the flight had settled into that familiar late-night quiet that makes the cabin feel almost like a sleeping train. Flight attendants moved softly down the aisle, checking on blankets and empty glasses, while most passengers drifted between light sleep and the vague awareness of engines humming far in the background. Near the front, though, at least 2 passengers were wide awake. For the children of Captain Andrei Dutov, this was not just a long-haul flight to a distant city. It was a rare chance to see their father in the strange, elevated world where he spent so much of his working life. In the early 1990s, security culture in commercial aviation was in a transitional phase, but cockpit access on many airlines was still surprisingly informal by later standards. The days of widespread hijackings in the 1970s had brought tighter procedures, but the strict, locked-door regimes that would follow in the 2000s were not yet in place, especially on airlines adapting from earlier Soviet norms. On Aeroflot flights, particularly where senior crew brought family members, it was not unheard of for children to sit briefly in the cockpit jump seat during cruise. This practice was unofficial but tolerated, and in some circles, it was even viewed as a kind of harmless perk, an almost sentimental gesture in an otherwise serious profession. So, at some point during the night, the cockpit door of Flight 593 opened with an unremarkable click. The captain's daughter and son were brought forward, ushered into the small, almost cramped space that controlled the massive machine they had just walked through in the cabin. The cockpit of the Airbus A310 was not large. 2 wide pilot seats dominated the front, flanked by side consoles and framed by the tall windows. Behind them was the jump seat, a fold-out perch where a relief pilot or visiting crew member could sit strapped in during critical phases of flight. From that jump seat, the view forward was hypnotic. The glowing rectangles of the primary flight displays, the soft green and amber of navigation screens, the faint reflections of indicator lights on the glass at night. To a child, it looked less like a workplace and more like the command deck of a spaceship, full of coded symbols and mysterious switches. Captain Dutov, like many pilots when introducing their children to the cockpit, was balancing 2 roles at once. He remained responsible for the safe operation of the airplane, but he was also a proud father wanting to share something of his world, to show them not just the destination, but the process itself. The autopilot was engaged, as it normally was at cruise. In this regime, the airplane more or less flew itself along the programmed route, maintaining altitude and heading while the pilots monitored systems, watched for changes in weather or traffic, and stayed in contact with air traffic control. To demonstrate this to his children, the captain could point to the displays that showed a perfectly level horizon, a constant altitude, and the route line stretching ahead. He could explain that the computers were following instructions entered earlier in the flight, and that the crew's job now was to supervise rather than continuously move the controls. Allowing a child to sit in the captain's seat, just for a moment, felt more symbolic than dangerous. On older, manually flown aircraft, it was common practice for pilots to briefly let a visitor rest their hands on the yoke while the autopilot remained in control, as long as the visitor did not apply significant force. But in the Airbus, the relationship between the physical controls and the automation was more subtle. The aircraft's systems could interpret sustained or forceful inputs on the control column as a signal that the human pilot wanted to override or partially disengage the autopilot, shifting control in ways that were not always obvious to someone used to more traditional designs. To a child, the control column was an irresistible object. It looked like the steering wheel of an enormous, invisible car, a device that ought to be turned, nudged, experimented with, especially if the aircraft seemed so stable that any movement felt inconsequential. As the minutes passed, one of the children was allowed to sit in the left seat, the captain's seat, with the adults close by. It may have seemed almost like a game. Look at the horizon, look at the lights, feel the slight vibration of the aircraft as it cut through the thin night air. From a human perspective, the cockpit environment did not appear to change. The cabin remained calm, the engines sounded the same, and the displays still showed normal engine parameters and a steady altitude. But on the primary flight display, a very small, very gradual change began to appear. The tiny aircraft symbol, instead of remaining perfectly level, started to lean ever so slightly to one side, its wings no longer exactly aligned with the artificial horizon line. A bank of just a few degrees at cruise, entered slowly, can feel almost imperceptible. Without a visual horizon outside, and with the body's inner ear often fooled by sustained, gentle motion, even trained pilots can miss the onset of a shallow roll, especially if they are distracted or assume the automation is still in full, protective control. Inside the computers that controlled Flight 593, logic trees were being followed with complete, unhurried precision. The autopilot sensed control inputs, interpreted them according to its programming, and responded in a way that made sense to the engineers who had designed it, but not necessarily to pilots whose mental model of who is flying depended heavily on clear, unambiguous cues. To the adults in the cockpit, it still looked and felt like a routine moment. A proud father letting his child share the view, a modern airliner doing what modern airliners do best, absorbing small disturbances and maintaining the planned path. The instruments did not yet scream for attention. There was no sudden jolt, no alarm that forced everyone instantly back into pure professional focus. In retrospect, investigators would later freeze these seconds and minutes in simulator recreations and cockpit voice recordings, examining exactly when the autopilot began to relinquish parts of its authority. They would measure how long and how firmly the control column had been held, how the autopilot channels interpreted those inputs, and when the aircraft subtly moved from fully managed to a more ambiguous, partly manual state. But in the living, unedited present of that night, no one had the benefit of hindsight. For the crew of Flight 593, the context was not a laboratory or a safety board hearing. It was an ordinary flight in which nothing obviously wrong seemed to be happening, until, in a matter of moments, it suddenly was. The child's hands on the controls, the slight but persistent pressure, the algorithms in the Airbus's brain interpreting that pressure as intent. These were not, in isolation, dramatic events. Yet together, they were quietly changing the fundamental question at the heart of the cockpit. Who exactly was flying this airplane? At that precise stage, the answer was no longer as simple as the autopilot. The aircraft was still within safe parameters, still well above the unforgiving mountains hidden in the dark below. But it was beginning a slow drift toward a regime where automation would no longer cushion human error in the way everyone on the flight deck instinctively expected. When the airplane stops obeying, the first clear sign that something was wrong did not come with a dramatic lurch or a blaring alarm. It began instead as a creeping mismatch between what the pilots believed the automation was doing and what the aircraft was actually doing in the thin air above the Siberian mountains. On the primary flight display, the bank angle indicator was no longer hugging zero. The little symbolic airplane, instead of sitting perfectly wings level, had leaned noticeably to the right. First a few degrees, then more. In a fully engaged, properly functioning autopilot mode, this should not have persisted. If turbulence or a gust rolled the aircraft, the system would respond by commanding opposite aileron and spoilers, quietly returning the wings to level. But on Flight 593, the logic had changed. Sustained pressure on the control column, seemingly playful in the eyes of a child, benign in the eyes of adults watching, had eventually been interpreted as a deliberate attempt to hand-fly the aircraft. According to the design philosophy, if a pilot truly wanted to override the autopilot, the system should defer. So, bit by bit, one of the autopilot channels disengaged, transferring control authority over the roll axis back to human hands, even though no one in the cockpit consciously intended to take over. This is the kind of subtle trap that emerges at the intersection of human assumptions and machine rules. The engineers who wrote the software wanted pilots to retain ultimate authority. The pilots, coming from more analog backgrounds, were used to autopilots that either clearly on or clearly off, with little ambiguity in between. With roll now effectively under manual control, the aircraft continued to bank. A few degrees became 10, then 15, and the invisible forces acting on the airplane, lift vectors, load factors, the balance between wings and vertical tail, began to shift in ways the passengers could not feel, but the instruments faithfully recorded. In the cabin, nothing yet felt alarming. Slight bank angles at altitude often feel like nothing more than a gentle lean, easily mistaken for a routine turn if noticed at all. In the cockpit, though, the displays were telling a more urgent story. The bank angle tape crept further to the right, and the heading began to wander from the planned track, the aircraft slowly arcing away from the invisible highway it had been following through the sky. At some point, the child in the captain's seat relinquished the controls, and the adults resumed direct physical possession of the cockpit. But by then, the aircraft's attitude and the autopilot's status were no longer in the comfortable, predictable regime they had been in at the start of the visit. Reconstructing the next moments from the flight data recorder, investigators would later see a pattern of inputs. There were attempts to counter the roll, control movements that briefly reduced the bank angle, followed by further drift as the crew tried to understand exactly which systems were engaged and which were not. This is one of the most dangerous possible states in modern cockpit operations. Not outright failure, but confusion. If a system dies completely, alarms sound, lights flash, and procedures are clear. When a system silently changes mode in a way the crew does not fully recognize, precious seconds can be lost simply to interpretation. The Airbus A310's automation, compared to later fly-by-wire models, provided fewer layers of envelope protection. It could assist, stabilize, and manage, but it would not always prevent the aircraft from entering attitudes that demanded immediate, skilled corrective action from the humans at the controls. As the right bank increased past 30 degrees, the forces involved began to change character. In level cruise, lift acts mostly straight up. In a banked turn, part of that lift vector tilts sideways, requiring either an increase in total lift by pulling back on the controls or an acceptance of descent. In the case of Flight 593, the developing bank was not part of a deliberate, coordinated turn. It was a growing, uncommanded attitude that, if left unchecked, would soon demand more lift than the wings could reasonably provide at that speed and altitude. The aircraft began to lose altitude, not in a dramatic plunge at first, but in a subtle sag. Hundreds of feet, then more, enough to show clearly on the altimeter and vertical speed indicator, and enough to require prompt, corrective control inputs. In the cockpit, voices grew more focused. The easy, conversational tone of crews gave way to sharper exchanges as the pilots tried to diagnose why the airplane was banking so steeply and why it no longer seemed to respond quite the way they expected when they moved the controls. The situation now demanded a swift mental reset, from demonstrating the cockpit to the kids to recovering an airliner from an abnormal attitude at night over mountains. That transition is not just a change in task, it is a wrenching shift in state of mind, made harder by the fact that there had been no obvious trigger, no loud bang, no engine fire, no structural failure. To regain control, the crew needed three things very quickly: an accurate picture of the aircraft's actual configuration, a shared understanding of who was flying, and a decisive set of corrective maneuvers to roll the aircraft level and arrest the descent. Each of those depended on clear communication and a correct reading of the instruments, which were now changing rapidly as the bank angle increased and the nose began to drop more noticeably. Bank angles pushed past 45 degrees, then toward 90, entering a regime that airline crews seldom see outside of simulators or aerobatic aircraft. At such extremes, the aircraft's aerodynamics and the pilot's instincts both come under severe stress. Control field changes, lift priorities invert, and the horizon on the display swings violently, demanding strong, coordinated inputs. In the seconds that followed, Flight 593 crossed a critical threshold. The aircraft was no longer just drifting out of trim. It was moving into a fully developed upset, an attitude and flight path so far from normal that standard, gentle corrections would no longer be enough. From the cabin, passengers might have finally felt something was wrong. The sense of being pressed sideways in their seats, the odd angle of the cabin relative to their inner ear, perhaps a glimpse of the wing at a startling angle through a window. In the cockpit, alarms would begin to sound, the calm symphony of routine chimes giving way to more urgent tones that demanded immediate, expert action. The dive and the fight for control. When Aeroflot Flight 593 finally snapped past the edge of what the autopilot and routine trim corrections could conceal, the transition from uncomfortable to critical was brutally fast. The right bank, which had crept up almost politely at first, now steepened into something closer to a knife-edge attitude, and the nose fell through the horizon on the primary flight display like a dropped weight. In those moments, the aircraft entered what safety investigators later classified as a full-blown upset. Instead of a controlled, coordinated turn at a few degrees per second, the A310 rolled and pitched towards a combination of high bank angle and steep descent that transport category jets are simply not meant to inhabit for long. Aerodynamically, everything was changing at once. As the bank approached and then exceeded 90 degrees, the lift vector that normally held the airplane up was increasingly pointed sideways, and gravity began to win the argument in the vertical plane. The vertical speed indicator, once a placid line near zero, swung down sharply. Instead of descending a few hundred feet per minute, as in a normal controlled letdown, the aircraft began dropping thousands of feet per minute, trading altitude for speed in a regime where the margin between recoverable and catastrophic shrank with every second. Within the cockpit, the previously calm instrument symphony turned into a cacophony of motion and sound. The artificial horizon tumbled, bank angle markers raced along their arcs, and the altimeter unwound rapidly, all while warning tones and synthetic voices tried to compress a flood of information into simple imperatives. The physical sensations caught up. Crew and passengers alike felt themselves pushed sideways and then downward, their bodies responding not to a gentle turn, but to sharp, changing G-forces as the jet rolled and pitched beyond the envelope of normal airline flying. In the cockpit, the pilots grabbed the controls in earnest. The time for subtle corrections was over. They were now in a direct physical struggle to wrestle a heavy commercial jet back to a survivable attitude using muscle, training, and whatever mental bandwidth remained under intense stress. One of the core problems in upset recovery is simply orienting oneself. At night, with no external visual references, and with the aircraft in a steep, rotating dive, the inner ear becomes a liar, insisting on sensations that contradict what the instruments show. In such circumstances, pilots must consciously override their own senses and fly the panel. That means trusting the artificial horizon, the airspeed indicator, the altimeter, and the bank angle tape, even when the body insists that up and down have swapped places. On Flight 593, this task was complicated by lingering uncertainty about the automation's status. Which autopilot channels were engaged? Which modes were active? Had the aircraft reverted fully to manual control, or were there still hidden layers of automatic trimming and protection influencing its responses? The flight data recorder would later show a flurry of control inputs. There were strong aileron commands to roll the wings back toward level, elevator movements to arrest the nose-down pitch, and variations that suggested more than one person may have been touching the controls at different times or even simultaneously. This is another subtle but deadly factor in cockpit emergencies: shared control. If two pilots both input corrections at once, especially under panic, their actions can partially cancel or conflict, producing a net effect that is weaker or more erratic than either intends. Meanwhile, the aircraft's speed built rapidly. In a steep dive from cruise altitude, gravitational acceleration and rapidly thinning air can push an airliner toward or even beyond its maximum operating speed, increasing aerodynamic loads and making control forces heavier. The A310's structure was strong, but not invincible. The combination of high bank angle, high speed, and aggressive control inputs risked overstressing the airframe, especially if recovery attempted to pull the nose up too sharply while still in a significant roll. In the cabin, any illusion of normality had long since vanished. The unbuckled were thrown sideways or forward. Drinks and loose items became projectiles, and the strange angle of the floor relative to their bodies must have made it instantly clear that the airplane was not merely turning. People screamed, prayed, or sat frozen in shock. A few may have tried to interpret the motions as some kind of controlled maneuver, unwilling to believe that a modern jet could actually be out of control, but the violence of the motion soon stripped away that hope. For the pilots, the mental load in those seconds was almost unimaginable. They had to diagnose the aircraft's attitude from rapidly changing instruments, coordinate who was actually flying, decide how much automation to keep or discard, and execute a textbook upset recovery under conditions that barely resembled a textbook scenario. Standard upset recovery doctrine emphasizes a few core steps. Recognize the upset, disengage automation that might be hindering control, reduce excessive bank, manage pitch to prevent either a stall or overspeed, and only then return to a normal flight path. Each of those steps is simple on paper. In a real cockpit with seconds slipping away, they become a test of training, discipline, and raw composure. On Flight 593, investigators would later conclude that the crew did, in fact, manage to recover the airplane from its first extreme attitude through strong control inputs and a concerted effort to roll level and pull out of the dive. They arrested the descent and brought the aircraft back into a more conventional flight regime, albeit briefly, and at the cost of enormous structural and psychological stress. The jet bottomed out somewhere far below its assigned cruise altitude, having lost a huge chunk of height in a very short time. The G-loads spiked as the pullout compressed everyone in their seats, briefly increasing the sensation of weight before easing back toward normal levels. For a fleeting moment, it must have felt as though they had done it, snatched the airplane back from the brink. The wings were closer to level, the nose was no longer diving toward the unseen mountains below, and the instruments, though still far from their original values, were at least moving in the right direction. But the situation was still precarious. The aircraft had been stressed, the crew were shaken, and the automation modes and trim settings were no longer in their neat, predictable cruise configurations. Any mismanaged follow-up, overcorrection, re-engagement of the wrong mode at the wrong time, or another misunderstanding of who had control, could push the airplane back into danger. And beneath them, closer now than anyone wanted to imagine, the dark ridges and valleys of the Kuznetsk-Alatau waited, indifferent to human skill, error, or intention, impact, silence, and the investigation. For a brief, fragile stretch of time after that first violent upset and recovery, Aeroflot Flight 593 was again something that resembled a normal airplane. The wings were closer to level, the nose was no longer pointed alarmingly at the dark ground below, and the instruments, though scarred by the recent chaos, showed a jet that was, at least momentarily, under some degree of control. But momentarily was all they had. The aircraft was now far below its cruise altitude, in thinner margins of terrain clearance over Siberia's rugged interior, and the crew had seconds, not minutes, to stabilize, understand their configuration, and commit to a coherent recovery strategy. In the cockpit, the pilots were dealing with the aftermath of shock. Adrenaline, the rapid transition from routine to near disaster, and the physical strain of high G-loads all take a toll on cognitive clarity, especially when layered over persistent uncertainty about what the automation had been doing. The flight data recorder later showed that after the initial pullout, the aircraft did not simply slide back into a clean, stable cruise. Instead, there were further control inputs, some corrective, some likely overcorrections, that pushed the Airbus toward another instability, a second, fatal descent that began before the crew could fully re-establish a calm, managed flight path. At the heart of this second upset was a familiar theme: confusion over modes and control authority. Attempts to re-engage or adjust the autopilot and trim, combined with physical control movements, produced a dynamic in which the airplane once again strayed outside the narrow corridor of parameters, where small inputs have predictable, linear effects. As the nose began to drop again and the bank returned, the now damaged psychological margin in the cockpit narrowed even further. Every second brought new changes on the displays: altitude bleeding away, speed fluctuating, the horizon bar tilting, and every change demanded interpretation and action under extreme time pressure. Outside, the invisible shape of the terrain was rising to meet them. The Kuznetsk Alatau is not a flat plain, but a series of forested ridges and valleys, with peaks high enough to turn a low-altitude descent at night into a lethal collision course. The altimeter unwound again. The vertical speed indicator showed another pronounced dive, and the angle between the aircraft's path and the ground was now converging too quickly to afford a second full recovery attempt. Even a technically correct set of actions might, at this point, have been too late. In the cabin, the sensation of another uncontrolled motion could not be mistaken. The brief relief after the first pull-up, when G-forces normalized and some may have dared to think the worst was over, gave way to renewed, sharper fear as the aircraft once again banked and descended. Some passengers likely understood, at least in outline, what that meant. Others, disoriented and terrified, may have simply clung to the hope that whatever the pilots had done once, they would manage to do again, unaware of how little space remained between the jet and the mountains below. On the cockpit voice recorder, the final seconds would later reveal intense, concentrated effort. Shouted commands, cross-checks, attempts to roll out of the bank and raise the nose, and the unmistakable tone of professionals pushing against both physics and time, fully aware now that the situation was dire. But physics does not negotiate. The aircraft's combination of attitude, altitude, and speed reached a point from which no realistic sequence of inputs could fully recover before terrain. At 0043 local time, Aeroflot Flight 593 impacted a wooded slope of the Kuznetsk Alatau Mountains. The jet was traveling at high speed, in a steep attitude, and the forces involved were instantly unsurvivable for everyone on board. The impact tore the A310 apart and scattered wreckage across the remote hillside. There was no fire visible from distant settlements until later. The crash site lay in a sparsely populated region, and there were no witnesses who saw the aircraft's final moments directly. For those expecting the flight in Hong Kong, Flight 593 simply failed to arrive. Initial uncertainty, communication glitches, hoped-for diversions, perhaps a technical stop somewhere, soon gave way to the grim realization that something catastrophic had happened en route. On the ground in Russia, search and rescue operations were launched. Using the last known radar position and estimated track, crews began scouring the mountainous region, battling terrain and winter conditions to locate the missing aircraft. When they found the wreckage, there were no survivors. The debris pattern and impact marks painted a picture of a high-energy collision with significant lateral and vertical components, consistent with a steep, banked descent into terrain. From this point forward, the narrative of Flight 593 shifted from the experience of those on board to the work of those charged with understanding why the accident had happened. Investigators from Russian authorities, assisted by specialists and the aircraft manufacturer, began the painstaking process of reconstructing the flight's final minutes from physical evidence and recorded data. The flight data recorder and cockpit voice recorder were recovered from the wreckage, protected by their reinforced housings. Despite the enormous impact, forces inside them were the clues that would transform a devastated hillside and a missing jet into a decodable story of cause and effect. Over months, engineers and analysts replayed and graphed every second of Flight 593's last moments. They matched control inputs with aircraft response, automation modes with pilot actions, and cockpit conversations with the evolving profile of bank angles, pitch attitudes, and altitudes. One of the most shocking revelations, when the evidence was assembled, was how ordinary the initial trigger had been. This was not a case of sabotage, structural failure, or a hidden design flaw suddenly manifesting at cruise. At least not in the way the public often imagines such failures. Instead, the chain began with a human, deeply relatable act. A father allowing his children into the cockpit, offering them a chance to sit where he sat, to touch the tools of his trade, to share in the magic that had defined his career. From that point, it continued through a series of interactions between human expectations and automated logic that, individually, were all technically explainable, yet together proved fatal. In official findings, the investigators concluded that unauthorized presence of children on the flight deck and their interaction with the controls had led, step by step, to partial disengagement of the autopilot and loss of attitude control. They further found that the crew's understanding of the A310's specific automation behavior, especially under mixed manual and automatic inputs, had not been sufficient to prevent or rapidly correct the emerging upset. The report did not ignore context. It noted the cultural and procedural legacy of a transitioning airline, the relatively recent introduction of Western automated aircraft into a fleet long dominated by more traditional designs, and the need for clearer, more robust training in automation management and cockpit discipline. For the families of the 75 people who died, 63 passengers and 12 crew, the technical explanations, however detailed, could not fill the void left by their loss. Yet the specificity of the findings mattered for others whose lives would depend, in the future, on whether the lessons of Flight 593 were truly absorbed. What Flight 593 changed. In the years after Aeroflot, Flight 593 disappeared into the Siberian night. The accident became one of those rare cases that penetrated far beyond the professional aviation world into popular memory. Not because of a bomb, a mid-air breakup, or a mysterious vanishing, but because of an almost unbearable detail. Children, invited into the cockpit by a loving father, had been part of the chain that led to a controlled jet becoming uncontrollable. For investigators and safety officials, this posed a difficult challenge. They had to honor the truth of what happened without reducing it to a simplistic morality tale about misbehaving kids, when the deeper roots lay in training, cockpit culture, and the sometimes unforgiving interface between humans and automation. One of the most immediate and visible consequences was a tightening of cockpit access rules. Even before the global shift that followed the attacks of September 11, 2001, airlines and regulators became more explicit and uncompromising about who could be on the flight deck and under what conditions. What had once been treated as a harmless perk, a quick visit for a child or VIP during cruise, was reclassified as a potential safety risk. Policies were revised to make clear that the flight deck was a strictly professional environment during all phases of flight, not a semi-private space where informal gestures of hospitality could override procedure. At the same time, Flight 593 accelerated a broader conversation about automation training. As more airlines around the world integrated highly automated Western aircraft into fleets previously dominated by analog types, it became clear that simply teaching buttonology, what each mode selector did, was not enough. What pilots needed, and what Flight 593 underlined, was a deeper mental model of how automation behaved under unusual inputs. That meant understanding when and how autopilot channels might partially disconnect, how the system interpreted sustained control pressures, and what cues indicated that the aircraft had quietly shifted from managed to manual in one or more axes. Training curricula were updated to emphasize mode awareness and upset recovery. Simulator sessions increasingly included scenarios where automation behaved in ways that could surprise or confuse a crew, forcing them to recognize, diagnose, and decisively revert to manual flying when necessary. Upset prevention and recovery training, UPRT, which had already been evolving, gained additional urgency. The idea was not only to teach pilots how to recover from extreme attitudes, but also how to recognize the early signs of an impending upset and intervene before the aircraft crossed dangerous thresholds in bank, pitch, or airspeed. For Aeroflot itself, the accident arrived at a time of profound institutional transition. The airline was moving from its Soviet legacy, centralized, rigid, accustomed to older aircraft types, into a new era of international partnerships, Western equipment, and different regulatory expectations. Flight 593 became a painful catalyst for reform. It underscored the need for standardized, transparent procedures, rigorous automation training, and a safety culture that discouraged informal deviations from protocol, no matter how well-intentioned. Within the global aviation community, the crash also fed into a growing recognition that pilot error is rarely a single, isolated mistake. Instead, accidents like Flight 593 emerged from complex systems, organizational pressures, cultural habits, training gaps, cockpit design choices, and human psychology, all interacting in ways that only become obvious in hindsight. In that sense, Flight 593 sits alongside other pivotal cases where the interplay of human factors and automation was deadly. Each such event, whether involving mode confusion, over-reliance on autopilot, or misinterpretation of automated protections, pushed the industry to refine not only hardware and software, but also the doctrines taught in simulators and classrooms. For pilots coming up through the ranks in the decades that followed, the story of Flight 593 was sometimes used, formally or informally, as a warning, not a warning about children in the cockpit alone, but about the danger of treating automation as a black box that would always prevent excesses, always correct gentle wanderings, and always make up for momentary lapses in vigilance. In reality, as the accident showed, automation can be both a shield and a trap. When crews understand it deeply, it amplifies their capabilities. When they misunderstand its limits or logic, it can quietly usher them toward a situation where they must recover manually from a state they never imagined reaching. Beyond the technical and procedural changes, there is also a quieter legacy, one that lives in the emotional undercurrent of how Flight 593 is remembered. It is a story about ordinary human impulses, parental pride, curiosity, the urge to share, that collided with the unforgiving mechanics of high-altitude flight. For families of the victims, the narrative of lessons learned is bittersweet at best. No amount of improved training or stricter cockpit doors can bring back the people lost that night, or fully reconcile the fact that what began as an intimate, familial moment ended with an entire aircraft scattered across a mountainside. And yet, in aviation, every hard-won lesson carries forward. Procedures tightened because of Flight 593 now apply to flights halfway around the world, carrying people who will never know the name of the Aeroflot crew or the model of the Airbus that fell in Siberia. Each time a modern crew gently but firmly declines a request for a cockpit visit or carefully verbalizes which automation modes are active during a handover, some faint echo of this accident is present. Each time simulator instructors drill future captains on upset recovery and mode awareness, the chain that doomed Flight 593 is being deliberately broken, link by link. In the end, the story of Aeroflot Flight 593 is not just about a crash in 1994. It is about the uneasy but essential partnership between people and machines in environments where tiny misunderstandings can have irreversible consequences. Modern air travel remains extraordinarily safe in large part because the industry refuses to treat accidents as isolated tragedies. Instead, each one, Flight 593 among them, is dissected and woven into training manuals, software updates, and quiet cockpit habits that make new disasters less likely. Today, the final image is not the impact itself, but its aftermath. Investigators combing through wreckage and data, policymakers rewriting rules, instructors adjusting syllabi, and pilots briefing each other on what must never be allowed to happen again. In that sense, the passengers and crew of Aeroflot, Flight 593, who never reached Hong Kong, are still traveling with every person who boards an airliner, protected by lessons written in the hardest possible way.